Jessica only intended to buy a school uniform at a store owned by her father, but instead, she faced cold and cruel disdain from the store manager, who saw only the color of her skin and not her as a person. The humiliation and harsh accusations escalated into something much bigger when Jessica decided not to stay silent, and the truth about her identity became the final straw. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned observers, but let's start from the beginning. Jessica was slowly walking down the street, enjoying a sunny summer day. She arrived at the new school clothing store that her father had recently purchased. This store was important to the whole family. Her father had worked hard to acquire the business, and now they felt like they could contribute something of their own to the place. Jessica decided to stop by to see how the store was running and pick out a school uniform for the upcoming academic year. Upon entering the store, Jessica immediately sensed something off about the atmosphere. Everything looked perfect. Neatly arranged shelves of clothing, cleanliness, and order. But there was an intangible tension in the air that made her feel uneasy. She quickly brushed off these feelings, attributing them to the excitement of the new situation. She began browsing through the clothing racks, picking out a few shirts and skirts. It was then that her attention was drawn to a woman standing nearby, the store manager, Karen. Jessica noticed Karen throwing her a sidelong glance, and a coldness seemed to seep into the air. Karen started to approach her expression turning hard and suspicious. She stopped right in front of Jessica and looked her up and down, as if scrutinizing every detail of her appearance. Then, with clear disdain in her voice, she asked, "What are you doing here?" Jessica was stunned by such a direct question. She hadn't expected that her presence in a store her family owned would provoke such a reaction. But she stayed calm and replied, "I'm picking out a school uniform." Karen squinted, her voice dripping with even more contempt. "This store isn't for you. If you're looking for something cheaper, you can go to the discount section. We don't give things away for free here." Jessica froze in place. She couldn't believe someone could speak to her like that in such a public setting. This was blatant racism, and she knew it. But instead of letting her emotions get the better of her, she reminded herself who she was and where she stood. "I'm here to buy clothes, and I have money," Jessica firmly responded, trying to keep her composure. Karen didn't seem satisfied with this answer. She pressed on. "We don't have time for games. If you're not buying anything, you should leave. This store is for people who can afford it." Jessica looked at Karen with genuine surprise. She couldn't believe that the manager of a store her father owned was so openly hostile. But something inside her refused to back down. Jessica remembered all the conversations she had with her father, his advice about the importance of standing up for herself and the truth. Her voice became steadier. "You don't even know who I am, and I have every right to be here." Ignoring her words, Karen turned to one of the security guards and sharply nodded in Jessica's direction. "Call security. She needs to be escorted out." The security guard hesitated, looking puzzled by the situation. But Karen was unwavering, her face expressing absolute certainty in her actions. Jessica's heart began to race, not out of fear, but out of indignation. She knew she had every right to be there, and she wasn't going to allow herself to be treated so unfairly. She felt her anger growing. Jessica knew that Karen had no idea who she was, but that didn't excuse her behavior. Every gesture, every word from the manager was filled with not just contempt, but outright hatred that couldn't be ignored. Karen turned to the security guard, who was standing nearby, and although he seemed uncertain, he began to move toward them. Jessica understood that the situation could quickly spiral out of control. "Do you hear me, girl?" Karen crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze icy. "Get out of here before I call the police. We don't serve people like you." "People like you?" Those words hit like a blow. Inside Jessica, everything was boiling. This wasn't just prejudice, it was open racism. She knew she had to do something, but her hands trembled with anger. Taking a deep breath, she kept her cool and pulled out her phone. Jessica didn't argue or shout. Instead, she quickly dialed her father's number. This wasn't just a personal conflict. It was a matter of principle. She knew her father wouldn't tolerate such treatment of his daughter, or anyone else for that matter. "Dad?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "Can you come to the store? We have a problem." Her father didn't ask unnecessary questions. He knew his daughter, and if she was calling, it meant the situation was serious. He promised to be there in a few minutes. Karen watched Jessica as she talked on the phone. Her expression grew more tense, as if she was determined to assert her authority and maintain control over the situation. "Do you think anything will change if you call someone?" Karen smirked, clearly trying to provoke Jessica further. "I make the rules in this store." Jessica, finishing her conversation, put her phone back in her pocket. She wasn't as nervous as she had been at the beginning. Now, she was driven by a sense of justice and confidence that her father would handle the matter. "That's what you think," she replied calmly. "But soon you'll learn the truth." Of course, Karen didn't understand what Jessica meant. For her, this was just another display of her power, another victory over someone she deemed beneath her. However, the store was starting to fill with customers, and some of them began to take notice of what was happening. Even the security guard hesitated, seeing that the situation was growing more tense. Jessica stood still, waiting for her father's arrival, while Karen continued to look down at her, confident that her decisions would go unpunished. A few minutes later, the store's door opened, and Jessica's father confidently walked in. He was a tall, distinguished man, whose presence immediately drew attention. His eyes showed tension, but his expression remained calm. He headed straight for Jessica, noticing that a small crowd had gathered around her. Her father glanced at Karen, who, not recognizing him, continued to stand with a haughty expression. Without waiting for a response from her, he approached his daughter and, hugging her, asked, "What happened, Jessica?" Jessica quietly explained that the manager, Karen, had tried to kick her out of the store, despite her simply wanting to buy a school uniform. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of her hurt and frustration. Her father listened intently and then turned to Karen. "Is this true?" he calmly asked the manager. His voice was measured but firm. Karen, still unaware of who he was, arrogantly nodded, fully convinced of her righteousness. "Yes, it's true," she said, as if everything was in perfect order. "I asked her to leave the store because she clearly couldn't afford the clothes here. We're not in the business of giving away merchandise." Jessica's father looked at Karen closely, his face impassive, but the tension in the room growing. The surrounding customers started to pay attention to their conversation, and even the security guard stood uncertainly, unsure of how to handle the escalating situation. "Let me make this clear," he continued, trying to remain composed, but his voice now carried an edge of rising anger. "This store belongs to me. I bought it several months ago. And the girl you tried to kick out, she's my daughter." His words hit like a bolt from the blue. Karen's face paled, and her confidence evaporated in an instant. Her eyes darted from Jessica to her father as she began to realize the enormity of her mistake. She had clearly not expected things to turn out this way. Struggling to speak, she stammered. I didn't know," she mumbled, both embarrassed and shocked. "It was a misunderstanding." Jessica's father cut her off sharply. "A misunderstanding? You insulted my daughter just because you assumed she couldn't afford anything in a store her own family owns? This isn't a misunderstanding. It's racism." Karen fell silent, unable to defend herself. The security guard, seeing how serious the situation had become, stepped back, understanding there was no longer any need for his involvement. The store was dead silent now. All eyes were on Karen, Jessica, and her father. Karen stood before them, barely holding herself up from the shock. Her confidence had completely disappeared, her face pale, and her words tangled in an attempt to justify herself. She couldn't fully comprehend how quickly the situation had spiraled out of her control. I didn't mean, I just thought," she began, trying to find some excuse for her actions, but her words sounded weak and unconvincing. Jessica's father looked at her with cold determination. He didn't shout or show aggression, but his quiet, assured voice spoke louder than any scream. "You thought you could judge people by their appearance. You thought you could demean my daughter simply because she's black? His voice was stern. That is unacceptable, and I won't tolerate such behavior in my store. Karen tried to protest. But I didn't know she was your daughter. Jessica's father narrowed his eyes, his voice growing even firmer. It doesn't matter whose daughter she is. What matters is how you treat people whom you consider different. You discriminated against her because of the color of her skin. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's racism. Karen could no longer say anything. Her eyes darted around, meeting the disapproving looks of the customers around her. The silence in the store was suffocating. People understood that they were witnessing something important. You're fired, Jessica's father said calmly, his words sounding like a sentence. Leave the store immediately. Karen, stunned and humiliated, stood frozen. For a few more seconds, she remained in place, trying to process what had just happened. Realizing that there was no point in arguing, she turned and quickly left the store, hiding her face from the watching customers. The store was silent. Jessica's father turned to his daughter and placed a hand on her shoulder. You handled yourself very well, he said, his voice now softening. I'm proud of how you stood your ground. Jessica exhaled, feeling the tension that had built up over the last few minutes finally release. Her father was right. She had handled it. She knew she had done the right thing, that she hadn't let herself be demeaned. Customers in the store began exchanging glances, some quietly applauding in support of the justice that had just been restored. The atmosphere in the store returned to calm, but now it was filled with respect and acknowledgement. Father and daughter left the store together, knowing that this battle had been important, not just for the two of them, but for everyone who had seen and understood that justice is possible, even in the simplest of situations, if you stand up for it. This day would stay with Jessica forever, not just as a moment of conflict, but as a lesson that you must fight for your rights and dignity, even when it seems difficult.